Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who have been watching this show, this used to be a show called the Builders and Funders Show. I'd interview venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs. This episode and the preceding episodes from this are going to be slightly different. And the reason they're going to be different is because a lot of people, I'm 19 years old, a lot of people in my generation have been sold this idea that entrepreneurship means you raise millions of dollars, you go have big flashy exits. And I found myself contemplating this very idea, this sentiment. And I found that actually the real entrepreneurs that I admire and want to be like are those who go into particular industries and build something from scratch and they stick to it for a long time. I've particularly been fascinated with the cigar industry. I think it's as I've gone to learn more about cigars, I've become a member of Tobbaconist University. I'm working towards a certification to become a tobacconist there. And I found that cigars, particularly, are the epitome of craftsmanship. And as I've learned more, I've had this desire to pivot the show so that I may focus more on people who are in the industry and who've been in it for decades, have had to figure their way around. And I figured this would be a good way for me to learn about it and share with others who may be young entrepreneurs looking at industries that they want to get into that isn't tech, that isn't flashy, but will build a long lasting career in something interesting, and then want to have an appreciation for the craftsmanship of something like cigars. And so today's guest, he opened his first ever store in 1995 in Princeton, New Jersey. He's been in the industry for decades. He's right now the president and founder of Tobbaconist University, the same university I'm enrolled in order to build my credentials around cigars. So without further ado, Jorge, welcome to the New Reverie Show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Well, Jorge, we've talked briefly in private about your story. You mentioned that you're around 19, maybe early 20s when you got into the industry. I'd like to first talk about how did you come across cigars? Was it always something you knew about? What first sparked that passion in you for them?
Yeah, I didn't know I had a passion for them, but I was around them. My dad was a Cuban refugee who came to Miami in the early '60s. He my grandfather smoked cigars when he would come home at night. He'd sit on the front porch when I'd stay with him, have a beer, and smoke a cigar. Then my father would send me down to the cafeteria when I was, in a single digit age to purchase him back then what was called a Padron number four. And I could buy myself a piece of gum with the change. He would send me down after dinner. Um, so they were always around. I would buy cigars in tubes in high school and smoke them, but I guess I just fell into it. It wasn't anything extraordinary to me until it became extraordinary to me, which happened specifically going to college at American University in DC in the early 90s. And I worked at a bakery where I met a retired spy. And he would come in an old, like, African helmet, whatever the British used to wear in colonial Africa. And he was the neatest guy, and he'd smoke a pipe, and he talked to me forever, and we became friends. I always had a fascination for older people. And he would tell me that when he would come on leave from working in the Congo, he would work part time at a place called Georgetown Tobacco. And it's a store that's been there now over 60 years in DC. And so I got on like two buses to go there one day. I had to see this place. And I was used to tinderbox stores in malls and places like that as a kid in Miami, or buying cigars at cafeterias where Cubans would have their Cuban coffee. Um, but I'd never seen a store like Georgetown Tobacco, which was like the most beautiful place on earth as far as I was concerned. It had like old, like 19th century apothecary furnishings, which David Berkebile, the owner, had transplanted from a small town in PA. And I remember that as soon as I opened the door of this place on Wisconsin and M Street in Georgetown, I got the waft of smell of, decades of pipe tobaccos and sweet aromatics, and then that more pungent cigar smell that had seeped itself into the wood. And I remember opening that door and feeling that. And then I remember taking my first step in and feeling the floorboards creak. And they're the type of wood floors that you don't even like buff anymore. You just throw like sawdust on them and sweep it up. And I just fell in love because it was a premium luxury cigar experience. And Cubans were smoking great cigars in Miami because they had the palate and the cigar makers like Padron making great cigars for them. But I had never been in an environment that catered to that type of client, and I fell in love with the industry. It's like a sophomore in college.
So would you have been around maybe 22 around this time?
So probably 19.
19. Okay. So you're
Maybe.
19 years old. You walk into this place and you're like, man, this is like, I've been into cigars, but this is like really, really like, you develop this fascination. Where do you go from there? Do you start, do you seek a job to get into that store? Where do you go from there?
Maybe I was too intimidated to seek a job. And I was working at a bakery real close to my house. So I could roll out of bed. And I was going to school. So I was having to support myself. I didn't want to do like two buses to get there, but I would save up every penny I had. It's great. You'd eat Taco Bell so you could buy cigars. And they were a little more affordable in the 90s. But I just was a sponge. And they had a great cigar maker going in there who just written a book named Paul Garmirian, who makes great cigars, along now with his son, blend that I love. Um, and I just started absorbing it all. And Cigar Aficionado magazine had just launched. And so it opened the world of cigars up for me in a way that I had never seen it before. Between Georgetown Tobacco, the people there, and Paul Garmirian, and meeting somebody who really elevated the conversation about flavor and the experience. And then the magazine, if you go back and read the initial magazines, to me, cigars were just cigars. I would have probably smoked them my whole life, but I didn't know there was an elevated experience about it. Cigar Aficionado helped bring that, I think, to the world in general. So I didn't plan on becoming a retail tobacconist. I would go on to open my first store in 1995, September 8th of 1995. But it was like a secondary thought. I had always been entrepreneurial. I manufactured athletic wear in high school. I was still selling that in college. I had every little business a teenager could have between selling candy and whatever. And my dad said, you should get into the business. And I thought, I didn't want to be a retailer, but I didn't know what I wanted to be. And I molded over. And, a couple years before graduating, I figured out that I could probably borrow 40, 50 grand from him. I think it was 44,000 or something. And if we could physically build my first store, then that might be enough to get started. So, I mean, I did it underfunded, bootstrapped it, worked, 20 hours a day to get it going. I was going to start originally in Atlanta where he was living, and then he got transferred. And he could live anywhere at that time in 95 in New Jersey, Connecticut, or New York for his business, his company that he worked for. And I stumbled upon Princeton, New Jersey, which was a great market. I had a store there up until a few years ago. It was there 29 years, a couple of years ago, or 28, I forget, whatever the math is. But, it was a lot of luck. And it's just listening to your heart, in my case, and timing, History was on my side also. There was a cigar boom going on, Cigar Aficionado. I was young and dumb enough to do it too, because you couldn't do it. You'd have to 10x the amount of money you put into it now. So being young and dumb is its own asset class.
Hmm. A lot of before we started this recording, we're talking about a lot of people are passionate about the industry and they never really quite know how to get into it or if they can get into it. You mentioned your dad encourages you. You can sort of get even if a little bit, you can get a little bit of capital going to build this first store. You mentioned being young and dumb. Obviously, there's a confidence that gives. I can relate to that. I did little businesses all throughout, middle school, high school. I'm still a teenager, but as a teenager, I was still building little businesses and little hustles. But did you at any point, as you were looking to build the store, looking to get into the industry in 1995, did you at any points have self-doubt or think, man, what am I doing with my life? Did you ever contemplate maybe if this was for you or if you should maybe quit and go do something else?
No, I mean, I don't believe you never fail if you never give up. So if you just keep working harder, and you have to be listening to the environment, right? And be willing to change course. Not everything you do is going to work, but I don't believe that you'll ever fail if you don't give up. And I just wasn't wise enough to, I was very lucky. I was like I felt like a rock star really in my early 20s with the cigar boom. finding a market that had just lost its decades old cigar shop. I mean, that's the town of Einstein, and academia, and a lot of great pipe smokers and cigar smokers in that town. Um, but no, I mean, if your passion is strong enough, you don't listen to the little voices of doubt and failure, I guess. I opened up a store, my next store within 13 months of that one. I went to Cuba within 4 months of opening the first one, and I just kept going, and suffered a lot in the interim. I mean, over the years, the boom died, 9/11 happened, the financial crisis of '08, countless battles against state and local taxation and smoking bans. Um, the culture changed around me. While cigars were celebrated, you could go back to Seinfeld episodes where cigars were being, and that's just an example, but cigars were being celebrated in culture because cigar aficionado had given them a new positioning. But then the culture changed and cigars were gross and it's the instrument of fat cats. And so I didn't realize the culture was changing around me because I was still committed to elevating the culture of the cigar. My positioning was a luxury tobacconist, not a commoditized tobacconist selling volume on low, on big discounts. I was trying to build, really value-added luxury experience as a retail tobacconist. I was what I would call a pioneer in the world of boutique cigars, not selling all the major brands that were super popular at the time, but finding niche cigar makers. I met the Padron family early on before I opened because I had been buying their cigars since I was 5, 6 years old for my dad. Um, I'm sure there's the limit of prosecuting me for that illegality is long over, I suppose. But um, anyway, no doubt, just passion and a little bit of good luck. It does take good luck and good fortune. I mean, Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, these people wouldn't be. You have to be in the right time and place. I just watched the Facebook movie yesterday. It was terrific, and I've seen it before. But you look at the timing and the accidents that happen, and right place at the right time, combined with enough passion and energy and refusal to quit or give up or to be intimidated by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and you may succeed or you may just have bad timing.
Hmm. You mentioned something interesting. You said when you opened your shop in Princeton initially, it was a town that you opened it exactly around the time that it would have needed something like that, where it had lost its prime story. You mentioned a lot of these things that kind of propelled you forward. If you're a young person today and you're listening to a story like this, I've always been fascinated by this kind of question of luck, right? It's like how much of luck is coincidental and how much of it could maybe perhaps be engineered. Do you think, you've got Tobacconist University where you pass on a lot of this knowledge and a lot of this information onto the younger generations or younger maybe tobacconists who want to get into the industry? Do you feel like that could maybe with the passion be engineered, where someone could do all the right things to maybe get luckier? Do you think that's maybe perhaps not something we should endeavor to do?
I think it depends on your worldview, I mean, and your God, and do you believe in synchronicity? And sometimes the failure is the accomplishment in life. So I don't know. Now it's an interesting question because it does depend on your worldview. But I shepherd a lot of people coming into the industry, and to be frank, a lot of them, I don't think will ever make it. But who am I to say to them to not do it? This is their passion in the here and now. Maybe they'll meet their future husband or wife next week in the pursuit of what they're doing. So, but there's, time is and synchronicities and things are happening all around us. So I don't know. Now, failure isn't always failure. I'm sure venture capitalists and tech people understand that too. And one failure snowballs into a success. My path was linear in ways. I created Tobacconist University because I felt it was a need for me to train the people in the subsequent stores I was building. And in the interim, I was also importing Cuban art because I could. And there was a gray area in the law. And I loved it because I was helping artists. But Tobacconist University kept snowballing for me, and it wasn't until about 2003 where I decided to not just make it for my stores because I had built up a reputation for being, a real professional and certifying consumers and my employees. And then it took till 2008 to to turn that inside out, put it on the internet. But then again, the internet didn't exist when I started Tobacconist University. So I was building things that there was no, it couldn't, a university for tobacconists can't be a reality because there's just not enough money in it to have a campus, right? And we didn't know what the internet would be in the late 90s. We didn't know what the internet would be by 2003 and then even 2008. And so I'm just getting a grasp of the internet now and how I can use it for Tobacconist University. Modern learning platforms, these online things where you upload videos. Everybody's got a course. You could buy a course on anything: crocheting, flipping houses, real estate, day trading, knitting hats, whatever you want. We don't use them at TU because I have reasons for wanting a custom programming platform, myriad reasons for that. But that didn't exist when I started out either. So I couldn't just take a video camera. Now we're working on our videos. Our videos are so old, 4K didn't exist. I'm not sure 1K existed. So things are always changing.
Hmm. That's a fascinating insight. Sometimes the failure you perceive as failure is actually success. You mentioned there's a point in which you get into the industry, the culture is booming. It's, cigar smoking's becoming a lot more popular. And then you mentioned there was a point in which culture kind of shifted, the exact opposite direction. I've got two questions on that. One, where do you think that culture is today? Do you think we've kind of pendulum, swung back into cigar smoking is cool? At least, from my perspective as a maybe younger man, I see online that cigar smoking is a little more popular among, guys my age. It's seen as, a status symbol, as an anchor of perhaps success. And then the second thing is, with in regards to timing, do you, whenever you see these shifts in perception, you see shifts in culture, it's easy to get discouraged. It's easy to think, oh man, like, this industry is going to dwindle. It's going to go out of business, or I'm not going to be able to make the returns I need to make. If a young person is seeing these shifts and these pendulum swings, how do you, recommend they deal with that? How do you recommend they maybe wrestle with those, swings in culture?
Well, I cannot claim to have seen the shifts happening. I saw them in my rearview mirror. But there is fortunes to be made in niches, right? And that is reality, especially harnessable with today's internet, no matter what industry you're in. So to me, it never mattered. Like I didn't know how I was going to structure TU, Tobacconist University, because the technology didn't exist. And then so we used to do paper exams and then certify someone, and they could have paper exams and mail them in, and it was so analog. It was like the Pony Express. But if you're passionate enough, you will find a way. You stay driven. Fortunately, I had the retail stores to support me, and this is not a business that most people get rich in. I'm not, me included. But I was just passionate about it, and so if you fight hard enough, you never get beaten, I guess. Or if you never quit fighting, you never get beaten. But I didn't have what I just kept going. Kept reimagining, reinventing, reassessing, never quitting. If the love you have for the thing continues to grow and you stay open minded, then you can keep adapting. And to me, it's an exciting time because I'm finally getting it. To your point, I wouldn't say cigars are cool again because I don't know what that means, but like it's true that the internet has empowered people to find their place and their voices. And I would say that the early millennia, we just lived in a time where a lot of money went towards anti-smoking, and cigars got lumped into that. And maybe we're finding, and then the FDA really went after cigars in a terrible way that was unfair. And a lot of that has subsided because courts have determined, things seem to have gotten out of hand here. We're not talking about science, we're talking about feelings, and let's relax. So there's a lot of people very empowered in the cigar world. I see them through TU, people coming to us, the trends, the empowerment of individuals. So I'm with you. I do think that there is a resurgence and a place where niches of culture can find a place for themselves to grow and be safe and supported. It's tough in this business. I was just reading an email now. It's easy to get deplatformed, debanked in this industry. Um, it's a very unfair industry for the little guy. Like any industry, things are commoditized, monopolized. The big companies always have an advantage. They have an advantage over the small guy in the cigar industry. The big vertically integrated companies own the mail order companies. Mail order, cigar mail order, you can't market on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube. You can't sell, you can't market sales. So, what are you marketing? So, there's like a lot of pseudo education or BS branding. Um, so, it's a challenging industry that's very unfair to the individual retailers, to the little guy. And TU is very much positioned to help the little guy, to support them as much as possible. But that's not going to change the structure that it's unfair. But we live in a culture where, where it's, whether it's like private equity, aggregating things, there's a monopolistic, there's only an illusion of choice, it feels like, oftentimes. But cigar smokers are the greatest individualists in the world because it's relatively stigmatized. And I love that individualism. You don't have to agree with me politically. You don't even have to agree with me if you like cigars. I love individualists. And I think you have to be a great individualist. Most cigar smokers or pipe smokers are. And that tends to be fascinating, if not just at the very least entertaining to me.
Mhm. I love that insight. You mentioned the little guy. You mentioned, how the industry has unfortunately been very unfair to those who are just starting and who are relatively smaller compared to these larger enterprises. I want to go back to when you would have been, the little guy when you were just starting out, getting into this industry. What Something I've always believed in is there's a lot we can learn from studying others' mistakes and sort of, the pits of despair they go into, or times where they're maybe about to go bankrupt or they're making big mistakes. I want to go back to those first couple of years. You open your first store, you're starting to, you need to get the word out there. You need to do branding, you need to do marketing, you need to get your inventory. You mentioned building relationships with vendors. What do you feel like were some big mistakes you made? Specific moments where you were like, man, I messed that up. Like that, I wish I hadn't done.
Yeah. Well, I should have always been building my own brands. So I should have private label cigars. I should have thought bigger. I shouldn't have been, so excited to build other people's brands. I should have sold other people's brands, but built my own brands, invested in my own brands. And I should have invested in an online business. And I was so busy with TU, that was where my heart was. After 5, 6, 7 years of being in retail, I had perfected it. Retail is theater. It's a beautiful thing, but I don't want to produce the same show over and over. So my heart was really in the education, and then that took up my time. So I've always been a person that follows their passion, and I kind of put money second because I figure if I die tonight, I don't want to have died not pursuing the things that I love, right? Or doing the things that I love. And don't get me wrong, when you're self employed, you're going to spend most of your time doing things you don't love, but there has to be that balance, right? So I regret not building my own brands. I regret not building my own internet presence in this industry. But again, I'm not a futurist. I mean, I didn't buy AOL or Amazon in the late '90s or early millennia, so don't take financial advice from me. But fundamental things, being where the future is going to be is hard to focus on, or at least it was for me. So my big failures were building my own cigar brands and being online, building a presence there, because it really could have helped me financially and scaling up from a retailer's perspective. But now that I'm with TU, that's very much part of the ethos too, and part of our, we want to help people help their businesses. So I don't want to see people make the same mistakes I've made. And then there's other things like, I mean, I was fortunate. I had good guidance. I listened to smart people. We work on a lot of this every day. Tobacconists don't want to ask for help. People don't know what they don't know. Um, so I was lucky. I knew things like the importance of inventory and accounting, and I've always been in charge of my books. A lot of people want to run businesses and don't know what their books mean, or don't know the importance of counting your inventory and knowing the value of what you have at the end of the year, the quarter. What's your ROI, what's your cost of goods. So not knowing what you don't know can be very dangerous.
You mentioned you had a lot of guidance. You had smart people, and you were listening to those smart people. Earlier in the interview, you mentioned your father was, in business. He had, been in for many years, and he sort of played this role as an encourager when you first got started out. Would you say your father was your primary mentor and guidance in this journey, or did you have any other mentors that really spoke into your life and encouraged you in that sense? And what do you feel like were the biggest lessons you learned from your father and maybe these other mentors you had when you were a young man?
My father was like a real corporate guy, and I knew I'd be worth tens of millions of dollars now if I'd listened to him and gone and opened a bunch of franchises. I couldn't have opened it without him because he would come in after work and help me build the walls and the humidor and my for my first store. Um, but I was always an entrepreneur. I was reading business books since I was like 11 years old. It was just interesting to me. Stephen Covey in seventh grade. I was reading The Principles of Success. And then, so, from my dad, I got some kind of fundamental knowledge and infrastructure knowledge, but his type of business is a spreadsheet mentality, and that doesn't interest me. Doesn't interest me. Like, business is not rocket science, I mean, especially in the tech world, you figure how you're going to scale something up, and it's all just math in the end. You could build any business with an Excel spreadsheet in theory if you can forecast stuff, but that's not. I love the creative aspect of creating the retail stores. They were beautiful to me. Every day it was like a theater. And then from Georgetown Tobacco, I fell in love with that retail theater, so I took that as inspiration. But I think I've been blazing my own trail and I'm a naturally curious person. I think that's the greatest asset any human being can have, spiritually, professionally, emotionally. I'm doing this interview because I think you're interesting, you know, and I'm curious about that. So I'm always curious. I'm curious about animals, and I still don't understand why we only see parts of the moon certain days or whatever. So curiosity drives me, and if you're curious, you can find the answers to anything.
That's fascinating. I was reading Mark Randolph, one of the founders of Netflix, has a newsletter, and he had actually published something similar pretty recently, where he was talking about, one of the reasons why Netflix became the multi-billion-dollar giant it did was because Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph were just really curious as to what they could do with this new technology. They're like, Blockbuster's an obvious problem. We don't want to pay all these late fees and deal with all this. And they just had theories and questions as to what they could do. And his sort of philosophy around that to any young person following him or anyone was, just be curious, ask a lot of questions.
And
I
I
see
guess
that
brave.
parallel in a lot of people.
They're probably brave too. Like, I don't really understand their business models, but I know they spend fortunes on they see the big picture. They have the 35,000 foot view. They spend a ton on something, but they can't exactly like precisely say we're going to spend $40 million on this show, and we can't directly tie it next week to the income it's going to bring. But they see a bigger picture. Business is like an organism, an organic system, right? So they don't just see one plus one equals two. They see different things. So you have to be curious and brave, and they probably showed a lot of courage. Anybody does. Well, Disney was courageous. There's a little courage involved too, and you just have to be willing to put the fear aside.
Yeah. Do you think I've always wondered this, because I've always loved studying biographies as well. You mentioned reading a lot of business books when you were younger. I'd do the same exact thing. I would not be paying attention in math class in middle school, and instead I'd be deep into some, biography of Andrew Carnegie or Rockefeller or whomever I could read and learn from. And something I've always wondered is, they exhibit these characteristics at a young age. Do you feel like because something you mentioned earlier in the interviews, sometimes you'll meet people, tobacconists, who come up to you and you can already tell if they're going to be successful in industry or they're not going to be successful. How much of do you think is just natural character that just is you versus how much of it do you think can be cultivated? If someone's maybe listening to this going, man, I don't know if I have those characteristics really. I don't know if do you think they could develop that later in life, or do you think you just kind of, do you feel like it's something you're born with?
let me say, I don't know if people are going to be successful or not, but sometimes I get the sense that they're not going to be successful. But it's not for me to, I can leave as many helpful breadcrumbs along the way. Sometimes you could just tell they're not framing the situation right, you know? I see people spin their wheels doing things that are not productive. I see people, there's a lot of ego in our industry, maybe in all industries, but ego is not the thing that should drive your passions or your business. And there's a lot of, and I'm going to go beyond ego and say vanity. People enjoy the attention and the socialization that they can get in the cigar culture. But that doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't run a business. Um, I'm a big biography guy too. I haven't read business books in over a decade. In fact, I can't even stand reading business books anymore. Like it's enough already. And now all of it's generated by AI, so it feels like the same crap. There's very little original content. But biographies, I do love. Lawrence of Arabia is what I'm reading now. Lawrence in Arabia, and that's interesting. He's an idiosyncratic fellow. People are who they are. Not everybody's cut out to be an entrepreneur. Although some people who aren't cut out to be can be successful entrepreneurs because they, you know, step into the right scheme or system. System. It could be a system. There's a lot of systems out there that, there's a lot of salespeople that step into the right system and they can become billionaires. So my interest is in creating something new and of value that is in sync with my heart and my passion and my skills. Uh, but not everybody is meant to do it. When I was transitioning my retail stores, I didn't want to put it on the market. It was my baby. And so now it only exists online, selling like a super limited collection of aged and super unique cigars. And I don't know what the future of that's going to be. But I didn't want to put it on the market and sell it, which was stupid. I should have, because, I'd like that money in the bank. But I empowered an individual who didn't really have the business brain. They would have been a great partner for me because my heart was in the education side and in TU, and they were very good. They got fed energy by dealing with people and helping them find cigars. And I was past that point in my life where now I get fed energy by creating valuable content that helps people elevate their businesses and their professionalism and helps elevate the industry. But not everybody's meant to run a business, right? So, but you can be an entrepreneur or just really good at something and get rich in an entrepreneurial setting. So it's different for everybody. It's such a dynamic world out there. When I was going to, so much more. I'm learning a lot now, thanks to AI. It's super helpful, teaching me about things. But as I said, the things that are commonplace to you that exist for everybody were just being invented. Like I saw the Facebook movie yesterday. That was just being. I was an initial user of Facebook. It wasn't even like that. It was like this, right? But so the world is changing at such a rapid pace. I was born into an analog world, and I'm probably going to die. Even if I die tomorrow, I'm dying in like a quantum computing world. So who am I to say? But if you work hard enough, you get a little lucky, you find yourself in the right place, the right time. I do believe, though, that you should follow your heart because life is short. And no matter what your worldview is, do something that tickles you, that makes you happy, that brings a smile to your face, and it'll work. It's not do what you love and you'll be rich, but, just try and align as many positive things as possible. But entrepreneurship is not for everybody.
You mentioned earlier in our interview that a lot of being employed, self-employed and doing your own thing is a lot of times you're doing the things you don't want to do. You're
The worst.
running inventory. You're dealing with things that are boring, that are monotonous.
Government regulation, it's a nightmare. Yeah, I don't. It's a masochistic thing, but your love and your passion gets you through it.
hmm That's what I was wondering because I think I've always wrestled with that advice on the basis of like, a lot of people, even in the tech world, are, they're the whole kind of overarching theme is do what you're curious about, do what you're passionate about. I've always wondered because it's a lot of people maybe think they're passionate about cigars or maybe any particular industry they go into it and they realize, well, most of the running a business, you mentioned earlier, and one of the things that gives you a sense of whether someone may make it or not. And it's not always deterministic, but it's maybe they just enjoy the socialization, but not really cut out for running the business part of things. And so I've wondered, how do you know if maybe you're truly passionate about something, you're meant to build a business in it and you can handle those tough parts, or if, maybe you should stay as a hobbyist, if that makes sense. I've always struggled with where that line is of being I'm passionate about this and I like it enough to maybe I could build a business in it, or passionate but I should stay hobbyist because I'm really not cut
Yeah.
out for this.
Well, you're not, even marriage isn't forever nowadays. Look, every cell in your body changes like what, every 3 to 5 years. You're just like a completely different person. You have the maturity of somebody maybe into their mid to late 20s. But the human being I was in my 20s, despite there being this continuity of action and passions, is not the same human being I am now. Your 30s are a totally different decade. I want to talk to you in 10 years, see how different you are. I was a different person in my 40s. I turned 50 a couple years ago. I feel like it's a superpower because, it's I don't give an F attitude now. This time it's for me. I don't have anything to prove to anybody. I'm just all in on doing the best that I can do at whatever I want to do. And if I fall flat on my face, I don't care because I know in my heart of hearts I'm doing the right thing. So uh, I can't answer that question because the person you are today, you will not be in a decade. You will evolve, so you're always changing. But then you can change. You're not. It's not a deal, a pact with the devil. You can go down any path you want in life, and you can change that path if it doesn't work for you.
That makes sense. I wanted to go back to two other things you said when you said, you look at someone and maybe they're perhaps not fully cut out for this. And that was, one is framing, the way they frame things, and the two is spinning their wheels, doing things that aren't productive. I want to ask you what do those look like in practice? What things might someone say or do that you observe that would tell you, okay, like this person really doesn't know how to frame things the right way, or
Business
maybe
is time and money, and you see people doing things, and you're like, okay, so you want to spend 14 hours doing this, and then you ask them, well, how much money are you going to make? And then you add it up, it's like negative 37 cents. It's time and money. Business is always time and money. So that's what it's about. And I can't tell you the specifics of the conversation I had yesterday because it would get out, but somebody putting on a big, extensive event like thing many days in a particular city, and it's like the amount of work they're doing for the amount of money they're going to make makes no sense, especially considering how much money they have. Because in this business, a lot of people with money do it, right? You can open up a shop. There's a ton of vanity projects. So if you want to do a vanity project, that's your own business. But this guy's telling me, things are, I don't want to go too far, but he clearly does not have the means, but he's so caught up. So he's on an emotional feedback loop that in a business that is where he is not considering the investment of time or the rate of return on his time and money. And also, I mean, unless you're independently wealthy, the return on your time and money investment is at the core. That's what business is. So people have to understand that unless they got money to burn. And if you have money to burn, set the world on fire, do whatever you want.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. I had, in interviewing a lot of investors, especially, I'd spoken to people who had been early investors in Facebook and Pinterest and Palantir, and a pattern I kept seeing over and over again was they had an exceptional grasp over their emotions. Whenever they were making these business decisions, they made sure they were removed emotionally and weren't doing it out of excitement. And a lot of them would, often tell me, and this was a pattern that emerged over the interviews I did, was, all right, like really remove yourself and don't be an excitable person. If you're easily excited by ideas and by people who pitch you, you're going to end up making the wrong decisions, which I get the sense is sort of the maybe core skill here as well, where if, they hear an idea or they get an idea and they get excited, they're easily excited, that immediately is going to maybe lead them to make these decisions, like you said, where they do something, run a vanity project, and they end up losing money.
Yeah, they don't see it though. There's, I mean, the one thing we haven't mentioned is emotional intelligence, and it's not my job to go through like, measuring other people's emotional intelligence. But if it makes them happy, fine. I'm not loaning them the money to do it, and they're trying to help them. But you can see how, as you noted, some people are they understand business, the model, and some people they don't see what they don't see. They don't know what they don't know. But they could be very happy. What do I know? So some people inherit money. They can do whatever they want. You never know what anybody's situation is, right? So we try and at TU try and keep people from making a lot of the expensive mistakes that I've made as a retailer, not investing their time and money in the right places. Um, but this industry does suffer if you're looking to get into it at the retail level or any level. There's a lot of vanity projects, and there's a lot of people who can afford to sustain their vanity projects. I have seen a ton of people come and go. Um, 80% of new businesses in this industry come and go at least, and then some people have the money to sustain it. So you never know somebody's background story. Like maybe they got a bunch of money in the bank. I can usually tell just because of my experience and personal knowledge. Like you can just see it like the Matrix, like bing, bing, bing. Like that business is not real, but it's real to them because they have the money to sustain it. And it's not for me to judge. Um, but you can see people stroking their emotional selves, to put it kindly, in this industry more so than others. And so, whether you get into this industry in any way, shape, or form, I would say the most important thing is, because your generation is going to change careers multiple times, so to speak. And you know so much about the tech world, you're going to be doing other things. But like I imported Cuban art from 1996 to 2003. And it's one of the things I'm most proud of. Didn't really necessarily leave a legacy. I think I imported more Cuban folk art than anybody ever had in that time period. And I loved it. I was helping the artists. And I loved the art. I love paintings in particular. And I would go to Cuba every year, and there's crazy stories of the things I had to do to bring paintings back, and there's a lot to tell there. But that had to fade away. I got in trouble actually because I got in trouble in Cuba because I testified against the Cubans in the federal trademark trial against Cohiba, the famous brand, and so I definitely wasn't going back to Cuba after that. So that's why I shut the business down. And I was really at the point where I needed a private plane to move paintings. But I'm so proud of that business. And I loved it. And I just got to the point where I was going to make money. And it was, 6, 7 years of doing that. And I would come back bloody because I was carrying paintings and the blood would be seeping through my shirt, dragging paintings through customs in Newark Airport or LaGuardia when I lived up north. But I love the business. So to me, that's my legacy. My legacy is how I spent my time. So spend your time well, and don't measure the success of that business, especially like in the tech world. Sometimes people invent little doodads or things that really get folded into bigger things. If you love developing the doodad and you didn't make the 100 million, but you made 1.8, and you got love handles like me and you're happy, that's success. So how you measure success is everything. If you love this industry, get into it, leave your mark. We need your technological know-how. This industry has been really retarded in its technological development, and I say that word properly. We have because there's a lot of old geezers and old-fashioned people, and it's an old-fashioned industry where multi-million-dollar deals are made on handshakes. So we're really getting there now, but you see people getting deep bank, deep platform. We can't advertise. So the cigar mail order industry is a science of using Google ads and all the metrics and the crazy science of that stuff. But that's left to the high-end technological field. And so it's hard for the little guy to make it. So we need minds like yours in this very old-fashioned industry. At the heart of what I do and what I've always loved is traditional, heartfelt human things that humans, knew and loved thousands of years ago, sitting over a campfire, enjoying tobacco. I love old-fashioned things. I had a dream for a time to build something called Old World University, where I wanted to have, and that could have used a modern learning platform, just have experts come in and revenue share and just teach things that bread baking is so big, right? Get your sourdough starter. I love all these things are in our DNA, more profound and deeply connected to us. Playing around on these things is not anything great. That's the truth of what I think. And maybe that's why the cigars resonate so much with you. So this is a great time to be bringing technology together. I'll even give a shout out to a new site called allthingscigars.co, which is just launched. I don't know what the future holds. Most things don't succeed, but they're trying to empower people with technology in the cigar space because most of the platforms don't empower us, and we've been, latent in catching up with technology, and technology hasn't been that helpful to us either. So do what you love, and don't be afraid of failure. And what's old is new again. And I think with the older things in the world and the most traditional things and more handcrafted artisanal things are better.
Oh, absolutely. I think in conversations with a lot of my friends who are around my age or maybe slightly older, slightly younger, I do see that yearning for, the older things, the more traditional, the craftsmanship, perhaps. I have a lot of, friends in their 20s who love pipes, who love smoking pipes like that. Normally would have been an out of fashion, out of style thing, but yet now I know a lot of young guys who do that, and they're fascinated by it. I think even in one of the classes I was taking at Tobacconist University, when it talked about just how many years, thousands of years we've been smoking tobacco. Like we tend to have this kind of blanket view of, it's just mass produced, but like no, like these are leaves that grow. This is natural.
Yeah, they had to
It
figure
grows.
out to dry them, to ferment them. Fermenting is still an art today. There's no spreadsheet or AI that's going to tell you how to ferment stuff. There's guys sticking their arms in piles, going the humidity, the temperature's right, flip it this way, that way. Cigarettes only came out in the 1800s. It was the Bonsack machine that popularized the ability to make a cigarette in a perfect tube and make a trillion of them and make all this money. But cigarettes have only been around this long. Indigenous peoples in North America and South America have been growing these dark air cured tobacco varietals. Then they figured out how to dry them, and then you can't smoke it then because it'll blow your mind, like it'll hurt you. And then you have to figure out how to ferment it. And if you're a cigar smoker, which most of your viewers, traditionally probably weren't, these are organoleptic delicacies that will blow your mind. You taste and smell things that you've never tasted and smelled on this planet. We're living in that golden age of cigar making where there continues to be this growth in artistry and finding new microclimates and then applying old technologies and old or new technologies and old microclimates. So very exciting time. But cigar smoking and pipe smoking, I think cigar smoking more than anything, you're tasting and smelling things that you've never experienced before. And great cigar makers will elicit something from these raw materials without adding anything to it. Just it's like great pizza making. Great pizza making is so nuanced. I mean, there's only three ingredients to make a Neapolitan pizza, but it's the little things they do. Well, it's like that with cigars, but there's 5 different leaves in this cigar, and they all came from a different farm, a different part of the plant, maybe different countries. And then there's this process of multiple years and the tiny things they did to it. And all of a sudden, this thing tastes and puts into your brain flavors, aromas, and tastes that you couldn't have imagined, and yet here they are. And it's very present of this moment because the cigar I'm smoking is 10 years old, and some of the things I'm tasting now while talking to you weren't there 10 years ago. And so it's changing as it decomposes, organoleptically. It's a totally different experience. The combustion's got to be right. It's a miracle of construction. How do you take a bunch of leaves and turn them into this amazing delivery system that combusts at just the right rate to burn off these molecules and then stimulate? I just read a great book. You may want to read it, The Emperor of Scent. And it's about this guy trying to chase like the brilliance. He was a brilliant, naturally gifted smeller, essentially, and a scientist. But what's going on in the, like, we don't even understand scent this much scientifically. It's like quantum physics of sensory experiences. We're just guessing. So that's my tirade. You got me all fired up. By the way, I want to tell you that this is not scotch. This is iced tea.
Ah, yeah. I figured it was something. I was going to ask about it.
Can you imagine? That was, wow. That would be some interview you'd get from me.
Perhaps we should do that the next time.
Oh,
Get
sir.
you.
Never on camera.
That's super fair. I was gonna say, yeah. I mean, I remember seeing an image of a leaf and all the little veins and the vascularity and
Yeah.
how that highway is gonna become the scent, the flavor, the aroma. I just remember thinking, man, that is like it's an art and a science that's been developed over so many years. It's so
Magic.
fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where my generation's headed. Of like there's a new fascination with the older things, with antiquity, with craftsmanship, with the artisanal, like you mentioned. But I do I do want to ask because you mentioned earlier, the industry is. It can use a lot of fresh blood and a lot of new tech and a new perspective. Traditionally, things have been driven a lot by relationships, and you mentioned $1 million, multi-million dollar deals being done by handshakes. I also want to ask, when you got into this industry, I'm sure relationships, even to this day, still mattered a lot. Who you knew, who you could shake hands with, who you could, rub shoulders with, like those things all, kind of maybe set you up for success. You mentioned the Pastrone family that you had met. You mentioned a lot of these important, vital relationships you built. In terms of, if you were a young person going into the industry today and you thought, okay, relationships are clearly an important aspect of me being successful in this business. How would you go about seeking out those relationships? How would you go about building those relationships? How did you do it when you were a young man starting out?
Knocking on doors. We have coming up next week the industry's premier trade show in New Orleans, the Premium Cigar Association's annual trade show. But then again, that's it's also a cluster F because there's so many people. It's how do you? We got our Dunbarton number, like 300 something people we can really have relationships with, remember, recall who they are. So so some people are just amazing. Certain cigar makers, they'll know 1,000, or Donald Trump, the president, seems to know, have recall of tons of people. Some days I don't remember the people I know. So um, it's tricky nowadays. It's almost like overload at a trade show. But relationships matter. One of my sadly my weaknesses is maintaining relationships. I'm more like internally oriented, creative, cerebral. I'm an introverted extrovert. I think, and you probably see in the tech field, those that master the extroverted skills in life, which it seems like you have a lot of those strengths to some degree. Those are the tigers, that can really make it to the top of anything. Obviously, I've known lots of people like that. I can be magic in a one-on-one situation and have charisma and be interesting, but when I go home, I feel drained by an experience like that. There are personality types that are fed by experiences like that. So, but I say always be a person of honor and try and have consistent, outreach, and pick and choose the people you have relationships with carefully, and always be a person of honor because that's going to matter in the end. And don't over everybody. Name dropping is a currency in every industry, but it is especially a currency in this one. And people call me all the time, and the first 38 seconds is them telling me who they know. I was with Carlito, and da da da. And it's like, who cares? And then you talk to the very people they're mentioning, and they don't know who they are. So that gets overdone too. Like, have relationships of substance. Don't worry about the numbers. Worry about the quality, and always have integrity in your relationships. So to me, that's very important.
So it seems like rather than with the depth of the relationships matter more, how do you maybe how have you practically built, those types of relationships? What does that look like in practice for you?
Well, I guess people have relationships, in my case, with my brands, what I build. And so oftentimes they know me, but what they really know is the brand. But that's good because I can't sustain 3,842 relationships with all the certified tobacconists and apprentices, nor the 20,000 people on a mailing list, right? Where my book gets bought, the Tobacconist Handbook. And so people call and say, "Oh, this is Jorge." Yes, it is. Oh, yeah. And then they feel like they know me. I love that. That's great. I'm actually always surprised because I've never built a business where I wanted to be the face of the brand. To me, the brand is the brand. But people have relationships with my brand, and then when they interact with me, I'm happy to be the surrogate human of that brand. But I don't build, and so, but there are other people that build brands based around their personality, right? Like it's different for everybody. Rocky Patel cigars, Rocky built that company by going everywhere, being everywhere, talking to everybody. I don't have that type of personality, but to his credit, he did that, and it's a big company to this day. So you be true to who you are. In my case, the brand is what I built, and I wanted people to have a relationship with that. And if they have access to me, then I'm happy to be meeting with them. It's kind of like they've already read my resume if they know the brand. In this case, Tobacconist University, how I occupy my time now.
Absolutely. I want to, before we end this interview, I want to ask about something you mentioned earlier. This is not related to cigars, but you mentioned when you were running the art business. I think you mentioned bringing artwork through LaGuardia Airport, and you're bloodied up from just carrying all that. You mentioned a private plane and having to get out of Cuba, or could you tell us
Oh,
that
I
story?
simply it had gotten. I kept scaling up the business, and I couldn't carry the amount of paintings I was bringing back. It had gotten up to over 300, and I'd roll them up in canvases. But it got to the point where, coming off a plane, the Filson bags I was using and the big tubes I was literally carving into my shoulders, bleeding, bringing these paintings in. So I had my next trip in '03. I had already done the Cohiba trial, and then I realized I couldn't go back to Cuba anymore. And or it wasn't the Cohiba trial, forgive me. I testified for the Cubans on their behalf. I think it was like 2001. And then I did a testified for another brand that was suing Cuba because Cuba took their name. I'm not going to get into the details, but then Cuba got pissed. But was going to have to rent like not a jet, but a twin engine King Air or whatever to go from like Havana to Nassau or something like that, or Montego Bay. So then I could get to a place where I could ship the paintings because I physically couldn't carry the amount of paintings I was bringing back anymore.
Yeah,
But I
I was
never
just
made that trip. It was exciting. But my point when I told that story was I don't know that I ever made money on that business, but I loved it. I loved every second of it. I love what it accomplished. I love everybody that bought a painting from me. I love all the shows I had where people got to. I mean, that's I don't care about a legacy. Like if people remember my name when I'm dead, I don't give a flying frig about it. What I care about is the memories I've had living my life. And there are people. Cuba's a sad, sad conversation today. It's heartbreaking, and I don't want to get emotional talking about it. But when I was doing that in the late '90s and early millennium, there's a picture in my living room, a very rustic, naive painting done by a guy who took a painting, and it's of a naked girl. The whole background is black, and she's nude, and there's a dress hanging, and he had a 15-year-old daughter, beautiful girl, and he's telling me the story. But it was happening everywhere in Cuba that girls there had never been to a restaurant to eat, and tourists from all over the world, Italy, Canada, some from the US, all over the world, were going to Cuba to date young Cuban women. And it's not hard to woo a woman who's never even eaten in a restaurant. And so this father happened to paint this painting, and I found it very touching because he had a daughter like that. I'm not saying she went and became anything else, but these are the fears these people live with. Now what's going on in Cuba is horrifying. I mean, it's no power, no water, no food, no certainty of anything. Um, but I was moved by it, and so I was able to give people money for their work that was life changing for them, at least for a certain period of time. So I love that business because for many reasons. Um, Being in the retail business started to feel like you were just daddy daycare for affluent men sometimes, who maybe didn't always appreciate the value of the theater I was creating for them. Because remember, when I got into the cigar business, we didn't have TVs in the stores. And I resisted TVs for a decade, and then people got TVs, and I had cameras. And when the smartphones came up, I'd watch the cameras because I would be in my office working and have different stores. And then smartphones came, and then people used to be like this talking. And then the smartphones came, and you'd see people like this on their phones. And then the TV came, and then you'd see people staring up at the TV. And so, I mean, that's just television changed the way people interacted in environments. So the world is going to change in ways we can't even imagine. And it continues to, right?
Absolutely. On the Cuba part, I've always been fascinated by Cuban history. I was traveling, to quite a few countries not too long ago, and while in I'd been talking to the friend I'd been traveling with, and we both really wanted to go to Cuba. We just figured, as foreign nationals, we probably wouldn't be able to enter the United States again if we did visit. But I remember we had been studying Cuban history a little bit, Batista, and then Fidel Castro coming, his guerrilla warfare revolution he led. It's always fascinated me, especially even learning about through Tobacconist University, how a lot of the Cubans that escaped after Batista regime's fall, they went to Dominican Republic and Miami and all these places. It's a place that I want to visit someday whenever I know I can do so. But
And in
Jorge,
between there, Batista came back. Cuba had their last democratically elected president was Prio Sogaraz. So they had a moment of democracy, and then Batista came back and overthrew his government after he had been in exile in Florida or Spain. And then Batista came back, Castro came in. It's a travesty. It's the saddest thing in the whole hemisphere, maybe in the whole world now, because there's nothing easier to control than an island, and hopefully things will change. But the Cubans that come here now are very different than the ones of my parents' generation. And, do nothing but pray for their success and, you know, survival at this point.
absolutely. All right, that's it for the questions I have. I know, we've gotten to talk a lot about your journey during this interview. Are there any things, anything that you wish we had talked about, you wish I'd asked you about, anything that's on your mind that you'd like to talk about?
No, I think we covered it all. Great. I think I probably deviated from your questions just to talk about the things I would want to talk about. So it was a fun interview. I appreciate you asking me. I'm here for you as a resource because you are getting certified, and that's why I agreed to do the interview. Also, because I think you're young, but you got an older soul, and you have a great way about you. Um, but follow your passion. Don't be afraid to take a risk and dig deep. I love that you're saying that there's a trend to reach back to older things, that are we're connected to generationally. So I hope to see a lot more. I agree with you. I think I see a little bit of that in the world. It's good to see.